Hello everyone, welcome to another webinar promoted by SoftExpert. Today's event discusses about process redesign on digital transformation initiatives. The webinar will be conducted by Mr. Stanton, a pioneer of process innovation, who has a great experience on improving the connections between processes, strategy, and governance and facilitating successful business transformation. I wish you all a great webinar.
Thank you. The webinar to talk about digital transformation. That's what we're going to talk about today, in particular, how it relates to those of us who think about processes, who design processes, who have some role in owning or governing or leading processes. And the way I want to start is by a quote from Alan Kay, one of the fathers of personal computing. And Alan once said, every important new technology first creates a problem and then solves it. And that's a very intelligent quote. Think about if you go back 30, 40 years to the dawn of personal computing, the first spreadsheet, Lotus 123, helped everybody understand that we had a problem with spreadsheets. Until that time, people had to work with pen and paper, filling out cells of a spreadsheet, and one little error made you change many other cells. And we didn't recognize it was a problem because there was no alternative. But Lotus 123 and then Excel gave us that opportunity to look at it as a problem. And that's the case with digitization. Digitization has a transformational effect of allowing us to see problems that we never thought were problems before because there was no viable solution. What does that mean? Think about something like farming. Think about how much water is wasted because we water indiscriminately. We water everything the same, whether each square millimeter needs it or not. But now we have John Deere tractors, for example. John Deere tractors can create a entire digital map of a farm down to the square millimeter. And instead of applying herbicide, pesticide, fertilizer, or seed in a regular average pattern, based on the growth history, based on current climatological data, they can vary the amount of herbicide, pesticide, seed, or fertilizer based on the growth history of that square millimeter. So they don't waste a lot of fertilizer for over-fertilizing some parts of the farm and under elsewhere. And so you get a much more better use of the capacity because you have a digital map. And what John Deere allows farmers to do is escape the tyranny of average and get to actual requirements for each square millimeter, whether it's flat or on a contour. That's what digital can do. Now we have a problem of water wastage that we couldn't have thought of before because we could only water indiscriminately. Think about traffic signals, traffic lights. How many times have you personally been waiting at a red light when there's nobody coming in either direction, but still you have to wait because the traffic lights are dumb? Now there are places in Scandinavia that have sensors built in at intersections that can see how many cars are going in either direction, and they change the duration of red, yellow, and green lights based on the actual requirements of traffic. Think of the productivity release when you don't have to wait at a red light when you don't need to. So digital technology is allowing us to solve problems we didn't even know were problems, most of which have to do with the massive waste that goes on in many of our organizations. Our organizations, our processes are, if we look at them through the digital lens, are riddled with errors, waste, redundancies. And so we have an opportunity right now, a transformational opportunity to improve the performance of our organizations by order of magnitude. But we can only capitalize that if we can accept new tools, understand the difference between traditional processes and digital processes, traditional methodologies and digital methodologies. There's an old joke about the Army generals fight the last war. Well, we can't use what we've always done to manage digitization. We have to do something different. And that's what we need to do because as we enter the world of digital processes, we can do things today that once seemed like impossibilities. There's a wonderful old law by Arthur C. Clarke, the science fiction writer, that goes, any sufficiently advanced technology is virtually indistinguishable from magic. And so many of our organizations now have the opportunity to do magic, and that's what I want this webinar to be about. So before I give you some examples of what that looks like for a number of organizations, we need to step back a little bit and talk about the world we're living in right now. There are a number of themes that impact every organization in every sector. The first is busyness. If you run into somebody in an elevator at work and you ask them how they're doing, they're likely to say busy. What's happening in most organizations is work is additive and time is limited. Think of how many email messages you get. The average employee gets 120 email messages a day, consuming 2 to 4 hours of their time. Think of how many meetings you go to. The average worker these days goes to 20 to 25 meetings per week, all eroding the time to actually sit down and think. And so busyness keeps us from focusing on the things we need to. And one of the things we need to focus on is the fact that no matter what part of the world your organization operates in, what sector, the world is moving faster. We're in a period of tremendous acceleration, not just in terms of technology evolution, but in terms of the basic metabolism of most industries. Things are moving faster, and we're seeing new things more frequently, being surprised more often, and dealing with more complexity. And on top of that, we've got this huge trend, which is key to this talk, which is we're moving from an analog world to the digital world. And if we add all that together, what we find most people in most organizations are doing is spending a third of their time looking for data, going through files, looking for data that's hidden in an exposed spreadsheet in an isolated computer, spending time on emails, spending time on the infinite number of projects that are going on in most organizations. And all of that keeps us from dealing with the fundamental truth that we've now moved from analog to digital. And those are just words. But if you think about it, for us in the process world, most of our history has been dealing with tasks. Our swim lanes are focused with rectangular boxes that describe action. That's what we focused on. We dealt with the tangible, the visible, the material. But today, the focus is switching to data. The information needed at each task, the information generated by each activity. And the world has changed from focusing on just objects to data about objects. And that's even an incomplete view, because where we're going is we need to be thinking about decisions. The digital world is about data, but data in service of decisions. I'd argue that every dollar your organizations have spent on hardware and software has not been about hardware and software. We don't need hardware and software. What we need is data. And what we need data for is to make smarter decisions to manage and operate our organizations. And increasingly, that data comes in the form of digital processes. So I've used that term a number of times. Let me give you some examples of what I mean. And I want to start with something that's not on the page. I want to talk about Tesla for a minute, because they did something astounding last fall that only got a little bit of press. And so Tesla sells 2 models of their vehicles that are essentially the same hardware, but are separated by the software embedded. And there's about a $30,000 difference between the lower price model and the more expensive. And as Hurricane Irma was bearing down on Florida last September, Tesla released an overnight software upgrade for the owners of the lower price vehicles, because the software difference between the 2 categories, the more expensive and cheaper, essentially let the more expensive cars go faster and go longer distances between charges. That's essentially what that $30,000 bought you, was a higher top speed and a longer distance between the need to electrically recharge. But to help its customers in Florida escape Irma, Tesla sent an overnight upgrade. So for 2 weeks, their customers at the lower price vehicle could have the same capabilities as the more expensive vehicles. They overnight, with a software upgrade, increased the speed and the distance that their cars could go. My Toyota can't do that. Most Fords can't do that. That's something that can only happen in a digital world. That's remarkable. And so we can do things that don't compare against the traditional world. That's one of the stories we need to be focused on. But take a look inside an Amazon warehouse where their employees wear handheld devices that allow Amazon to see where they are within the warehouse. And they've been digitizing every process within their warehouses, process by process, identifying how they can better support their workers. And they become increasingly smart at knowing what robots can do and what humans can do. For example, robots are very good at picking and packing rectangular products like books and CD cases. They're not as good at picking and packing and putting in their brown boxes automobile tires or umbrellas. Humans are actually much better at identifying, picking, and putting them in the appropriate boxes. So Amazon, product by product, is coming up with algorithms to better identify what people can do and what machines can do. And many organizations haven't come up with the right criteria to understand how much digitization drives to automation versus augmenting employees. At a more prosaic level, think about milk. Progressive farmers these days are giving their cows sensors, brick-sized sensors that live in their first stomach that gives them feedback on the pH, the temperature, the amount of water the cow has drunk, and their movement, and giving them real-time feedback on the cow's health. And then they can aggregate that at the herd level. Used to be farmers would look at the cow and say, "How you doing, Bessie?" Now they can look at their iPad and see how Bessie is doing in a variety of highly detailed ways. That's a difference. You can react much quicker if the cow is not feeling well based on the data. It's changed farming. The way it's changing wine. In the old days, wine was fermenting in casks and it would get tasted or tested once a month because there's a risk of exposing it to air. Now there are sensors in the wine that give feedback to vintners in real time about the acidity, etc. And so we can now, in real time, get feedback that was never possible before at fine-grained, detailed level. Some organizations have figured out even better what humans can do and what technology can do. As Morgan Stanley is one of those. For their high net worth individuals, they provide financial advice as to how to manage their portfolios and how to do active investing. And they offer now 2 tiers of service to their high net worth individuals. Tier 1 is an AI who can completely analyze the individual's portfolio and make an ongoing series of suggestions about buy, sell, etc. Tier 2, and more expensive, is the AI is supported by a human financial advisor who takes a look at the AI feedback and then massages it to add a human touch for their customers, and that costs more. And so they have figured out how to take the best of digitalization and the best of augmentation and offer that as part of their process. If we push this to an extreme, if you go to an Alcoa smelting plant for aluminum, you'd see a huge plant, several acres full, that has 2 or 3 employees. It's a lights out factory with the 2 or 3 employees sitting in a control booth where they have an entire digital map of the plant. Each smelter, each bender, each machine is providing fine-grained real-time data on its performance, and the folks there are monitoring the performance, and if all goes well, all they do is monitor. That's a different world. And so digitization is allowing new things. It's allowing us to escape the tyranny of tasks, the tyranny of slowness, this tyranny of waste. And it's doing things that are remarkable. Several weeks ago, I was trying to schedule a telephone call with an editor of a technology publication, and he had me work with Amy, his admin. And Amy and I exchanged a series of emails trying to work on a schedule. She's very pleasant. And finally, we got to a mutually convenient time. And as I was talking to the editor, he asked me how I liked working with Amy. And I said she was great. And he said, Amy's a bot. Her full name is Amy, X-I, Amy-G, and she's an AI. And I had no idea. I was I failed my personal Turing test because she was virtually indistinguishable from a human. And so we have technology creeping in places we've never thought before, and it's showing up in remarkable ways. And I would say my conversation with Amy showed magic in action. So there are all these opportunities, but there are some serious constraints as well that we have to talk about. We still have in most of our organizations fragmentation. Fragmentation is the enemy of process performance. Our processes never fit neatly or tidily into organizational structures. They're spread across different functions. They're replicated across different geographies. They operate in different business units. And as a result, we have fragmentation. And for any of you who are trying to create process standards, what you find is that everybody will say the phrase that's entertaining but not true, which is we're different. How many of you have heard we're different when you're trying to create the standard? But logically, if everyone says we're different, what's the only potential outcome? And so we have strong fragmentation. And by that, I mean the folks in your regions and your functions and your business units often can resist standards. They can resist consistency. We have fragmentation, and often we don't have the integration, the ability to behave as one enterprise. That's what I mean by strong silos, weak centers. Another constraint is the fact that many organizations are approaching process transformational capabilities of digitization with enormous timidity. They're trying to incrementally improve. They're trying to marginally get better. And I'd argue that you can't put an engine on a canoe and expect it to go as fast as a speedboat. Too many organizations are trying to apply just an ounce of digitization to a traditional process in the hope of getting a little better. And it's up to us in the process world to set our heights and our sights much higher, with higher aspiration and bigger ambitions to get bigger change, more aggressive change for our organizations, because the speedboat will always be the motorized canoe. Our competitors who are digitizing faster will outperform us. And then finally, the endless search for data. As I said before, all of our investment in technology has been around the search for a single source of truth. And the hamstring for a lot of digitization is the fact that there are multiple sources of truth, which is, of course, an oxymoron. And so we need to put our data house in order if we're going to really take advantage of the transformational capability of digitization. I've run into several organizations in the last couple of months who have elevated the process of master data management to a governing process that with serious power and a seat at the executive table as part of the support for digital transformation. If we don't get our data houses in order, it's hard to do what I'm talking about right now. And so fragmentation, timidity, and unmanaged data are some of the constraints that keep us from taking advantage of digitization. And what they're creating for many organizations is the paradox that economists have been seeing for the last couple of years, where technology investment is growing, but productivity in terms of the output per employee or output per dollar for organizations is shrinking. And this shows that those three constraints, fragmentation, timidity, and unmanaged data, are winning right now, and they constrain our ability to really digitize our processes.
Where here we have a poll, we could actually ask them what fragmentation looks like within their organization. So we'll launch that and see what the public has to say.
Perfect.
So if you can jump in and answer that question for us. So looks like 80% is functional silos, and 20% is all of the above, is really where.
Well, my reaction is my condolences to all of you, because those are tough. Those are tough to combat, because as you'll see in some of the stories coming up, many of the solutions I'll be talking about cross-functional boundaries. And if your organization is too consumed with managing border wars between different functions, it's tough to do what I'm talking about. And we'll come back to that at the end. But what I want to do right now is talk about understanding how digitized processes are the same and different from traditional redesign. And at the obvious level, what's the same about a digitized process? You still have issues of managing stakeholders from different constituencies. We still have to serve our end customers. We still have to manage our regulators. We still have to ensure that the performers who are working on the process are engaged. We still have to have measured process scorecards or dashboards. We still need some form of governance to provide oversight or stewardship for our processes. And at the end of the day, what really makes process improvement work, both traditionally and in a digital form, is that we really need to understand how our processes work. Too often, folks working on a process only know their tasks. They only know what happens when a piece of work hits their desk, and there's limited visibility upstream or downstream. And only when there's a deeper insight about how a process creates value can we either redesign it or digitize it. And so that need for a deep systemic disciplined understanding of how a process works is the key in both worlds, the old one and the new one. But what's also interesting is what's really different between traditional process redesign and digital differences. And so I want to start describing that in different degrees of difference, starting with what's a little different. But even a little difference is a lot. Can the process digitally connect and synchronize all performers? Well, let me give you an example of what that looks like. UPS. I don't know how many of you have been a UPS driver or know a UPS driver, but they have more process engineers at UPS than almost any organization on earth. They deliver close to 5 billion packages on time. And they do it with 99.999% efficiency. And so they've studied how to deliver packages. And one of their rules is in any metropolitan area, the UPS driver can't make a left turn. They have calculated that in almost all situations, 3 right turns are superior and safer and ultimately faster than a left turn. UPS has also invested in a technology and a very sophisticated handheld device that they call the Orion. In the old days, UPS would provide a route sheet for each of their drivers that would tell them the stops they needed to make every day. No longer. Now the Orion handheld dynamically reconfigures the route for the driver in real time based on pickups, actual numbers of packages at each stop, capacity of the truck. It dynamically reconfigures, and it does that in real time. It also tells UPS where every driver is every second of the day, so that if a driver does make a left turn, UPS knows it. UPS has a digital map of all of their routes and all of their trucks, and they are managing to optimize that complex system in real time. Now, a question that we're not going to address today, but an interesting one for you and the audience is, would you want to be a UPS driver today when all of that is laid out? There's actually very little discretion that a UPS driver has because Orion is their digital overlord telling them what to do. Is that a desirable process decision? UPS has decided yes, but not all organizations would make the same decision. So what's different? There's privacy protection. We've got to make sure in the world of data that we are making our data secure. All you need to do is open the papers today to see some of the issues about privacy. How well is your organization managing privacy beyond simple encryption? Can the process change? And can you deliver fine-grained customization? What does that mean? I don't know if any of you on the webinar are customers of Progressive Insurance, but Progressive has rolled out a fascinating new product called Snapchat. Snapchat is a device that fits in your automobile and measures 31 different driving characteristics. And if you are deemed a safe driver based on your personal driving, you get a reduction in the cost of your automotive insurance policy. In the past, the way Progressive would price their policies was based on averages. They'd look at you, people like you, people driving cars like you, people living on streets like you, people with driving histories like you. And based on all of that average data, they come up with a risk profile which would yield a price for a policy. Snapchat busts right through that. Snapchat's not based on averages, it's based on actuals. They are not pricing for people like you, they are pricing for you. And now, of course, there's the Heisenberg factor, which is knowing that Snapchat's in your car often changes people's driving behavior. But nevertheless, would you want Snapchat in your car? And would your answer be different if I asked, would you like Snapchat in your customers' cars? Where you could, if you were an insurance company, where you could actually change their behavior by having this device watch them. That's what we mean by customization. It's like airline prices. We're on airlines these days, and 100 people sitting on an airline, there may be 100 different prices because airlines have made us comfortable with dynamic pricing. But we don't have that at restaurants. How would you like to be the owner of a restaurant at 8 p.m. on a Saturday evening with one steak left? How would you price that steak? Now, if you've got a menu where the price is printed in ink, you're stuck. But if you're a restaurant owner whose menu is digital, would you change the price? Can you do fine-grained customization in real time based on supply and demand? With the digital process, you can. Now, I'm not advocating that you raise the price of that last steak, but you could. And that's what's different. We can do things that we could never do before. So what's different? What's even more different is that we can now automate recurring data requests. The minute we see Department A is asking for element B from Department C, we can write some code and start provisioning that data in real time. What we can do, as one procurement department did in a very large chemical company that was having issues in the procurement department where people were buying based on personal criteria, they developed a hardwired procurement process that only allowed their performers to buy in a prescribed way from prescribed vendors. There was no getting around the standard defined way, because if you didn't follow the precise fields and the precise screens, you couldn't buy anything. You couldn't execute a purchase order. And so when I talk about compliance being hardwired, with digitization, we can cut down on the number of versions we have if we're willing to be disciplined and hardwire it. That's different than the past. Are we Can we provide data in a way that's never done before? There are a number of convenience stores in Japan right now that are experimenting with putting RFID chips in every product in the store, so that not only can they do self-checkout, they can actually reduce pilferage, which is a polite way of talking about theft. Now, that's a systemic solution. It's not just for checkout. Every item will have an inexpensive sensor, says what it is, where it is, who it is, and use that to accelerate the checkout and to minimize theft. That's a systemic solution providing unprecedented levels of data. We can do stuff with chips right now. For those of you who are familiar with what a saguaro cactus looks like, those are the cactuses with arms going out at right angles. You see them in all of the Western movies. Well, for the last 2 years, park rangers in the southwest of the United States have been putting chips in the saguaro cactuses. Why? Because people have been stealing them. Now, those cactuses don't just look beautiful, they provide data so that if one of them goes missing, they can be found. Many hospitals are now putting chips in surgical sponges. Why would you want a chip in a surgical sponge? Sadly, many of us know the answer. So what's really, really different is that we're ending up not just with digitized processes, but smarter processes. More organizations need to follow the path of Amazon, getting crisp and clear on what activities are best done by technology or AI, and which activities are better done by humans. Whereas Morgan Stanley knows that a certain level of hand-holding for financial advice, where Amazon knows that unusual shaped packages require a human touch, in your organization, are the rules clear about what you can automate and what you can't? That's what's really different when organizations get smart about that. What's really different is when we take our decisions seriously. Many of us end up with those lovely diamonds in our swim lane pictures, but how much depth have we put into understanding those decisions? How many feedback loops? What's the anatomy of a decision? How well do we define the data required and the data out and the owner for the decisions? I think that there's a lot of work for us in the process world to dive in and understand what's going on inside of our decisions. And as we talked about data, that's clearly the case. And so what we have right now are smarter digitized processes available to us if we have the courage to change our mindset from incremental digitization for more dramatic transformational change in service of our organizations. So I want to end and then leave some time for questions by talking about where does this take us? 30 years ago, there was a toy for boys and girls called the Visible Body. And what it was is about 2 feet high, transparent outer skin, and it showed all the organs of the body. You could see the lungs, the stomach, the pancreas, the nervous system. And it made everything visible. And I think that's where, if you add up process digitization after process, we end up not just with digitized processes, but with a digitized enterprise, and that's different. Compare the depth of understanding that John Deere has about a farm with an in-depth growing history and knowing how to modify its putting in herbicides, pesticides, seeds, and fertilizer. They understand the digital map of a farm. Tractors may be driving on the ground, but it's seeing not the ground, the digital map of the farm. That's a different view of the world. Think about what UPS with the Orion system can do. They have physical drivers, physical trucks, physical products, but they're actually operating in a digital world. where all of those items have a digital appearance. Even more scary, think about what Google knows about you. The answer is probably everything. They measure everything, not just the websites you go to and the sequence that you go to, but how long you're there, number of keystrokes. If they could, they'd measure the intensity of the keystrokes. How hard did you hit them? But they know everything. Those are what the digital enterprise begins to look like. And so I want to close by saying, welcome. That's where a lot of organizations are going. We can make everything visible and knowable. I love that word, knowable. It used to be there were questions, what's the population of Zambia in 1968, that we couldn't know. Now, with Google, with online data, we can answer that. It's knowable. We can find it out. And much more about our organizations is knowable than ever before. And so at some time in the future, for those organizations who are going to survive, the data flows just as the central nervous system sends signals around our body, and the blood system provides blood and food to our body. We're going to be able to see the flow of data around our organization into processes and how they perform, where every action yields data and every object provides data. Again, we're going to be able to map our decisions and see how our systems interface between the data and the processes. We'll see how our staff is working and make that visible. And ultimately, whether we like it or not, and there are certainly a lot of downsides to the digital world, I believe it's an inevitability. And so that means for us in the process world, we need to be thinking hard about how are we going to take the magic of what Tesla has done, what Amazon has done, what UPS has done, what John Deere has done, what ANEG represents, and bring that to our organization. How can we augment our set of process improvement methodologies and tools to adapt to the new world? That's the challenge. And if we can do that, it will create enormous benefits for our organization, which should be our common purpose. And with that, Scott, I'm ready for questions if there are any.
Well, first of all, thanks a lot, Steve. That was very insightful. I like how not only did you tie it to tech companies, which I find is often the focus when you hear speakers about digitization, which then doesn't relate with the audience because they'll say, okay, yes, Facebook, Google, but I'm not a tech company. I'm an agriculture company. So I'm glad you tied it back to things like John Deere and Progressive in insurance and UPS in shipping. So you're touching on many different industries and how digitization relates to it. So very good. Yeah, we have a bunch of questions that came up. So the first one, someone mentions that where they feel there's a big miscommunication is between what is different now in digitization than 5 years ago. So he said it's a hot topic within his company, but there's a misunderstanding of what that really means. I know one thing I normally tell customers is think of historically when you're automating, you're often automating, like you said, incremental improvements and much more often back office focus, removing, non-value added activities. But now it's much more focused on customer driven value add and how you can use that data that is available to you to then change the process and how you actually work with your customers. So the customer facing side, but maybe if you can give your input on that, what's really different today versus 5 years ago when they're talking about digitization and automation?
Right. Well, sure, and thank you for the question. It's astounding to think that 5 years ago represents a century of technology evolution. But before I answer the question, I just need to clarify a little language. I'm typically careful to differentiate digitization with automation. And so I think digitization takes a couple of forms, one of which is automation, which technically refers to taking an activity or a process that was done by a human and having machines do it in some way, shape, or form, some piece of technology. I differentiate that from augmentation, which is how Morgan Stanley is providing advice. They have a human who's supporting or is being supported by an AI. And so I think we have a bunch of different forms. And so what happened in the past is we have the same opportunities to do some automation, but even more opportunities to do augmentation. Because I don't actually see technology always taking away jobs. What I see technology doing is taking away tasks, which is different. And taking away actually most of the boring, repetitive, mundane, transactional tasks that organizations have paid people to do. So one of the big shifts I've seen is when those tasks get automated, organizations, especially smart organizations, are actually taking advantage of that to give bigger jobs to humans doing things that humans are better than. So that's one of the big differences. Obviously, another big difference is you just look at the world of artificial intelligence, deep learning, whatever you want to call it. It's remarkable how fast that is evolving right now, with humans capable, with AI capable of doing things. I talked about Amy G, but many newspapers right now have a good chunk of their content written by AI. There was a movie that just came out last year called Sunspring that was generated by an AI. And it's a movie that was shown at the Cannes Film Festival. People said, for the most part, they couldn't tell that it was generated by an artificial intelligence entity, that there were occasionally some weird stuff. So what's going on, in addition, is the unbelievable acceleration of technology capability. And if your organization isn't tracking with that, you'll end up with antiquated and prejudiced beliefs about what technology can do.
Great.
So those are two of the big differences.
There was also a question because we had a poll that was launched around how to combat the transformation, and the results were primarily focused that their company's approach were still focused on traditional change management practices. So and then the question came on that is, well, what would be the latest methodologies or recommendations, and even for purpose of selling? Because I agree that often companies have a hard time adopting change management programs. They're much more focused on the technology side versus the adoption side and the rollout side. So any input you can provide on new approaches for sell and to actually adopt within the organization.
Okay, so I didn't spend a lot of time in the introduction talking about myself, but I have been consulting and teaching on process improvement for 35 years. And I can say without question that the number one reason process improvement projects fail is because of inattention to change management, which for me is not around systems change, but it's around the human dimension of change. Because all process improvement projects run along two tracks. Track one is the analytical, architectural, data-driven left brain track of coming up with analysis and prescriptive new process design. Track two is the emotional, empathetic, personal track. And the number one, probably the number 1, 2, and 3 reasons these projects fail, process projects fail, whether big or small, is they don't pay enough attention to change management. And the manifestation of that is they don't spend enough time and energy. The rule of thumb I suggest to process improvement teams is that half of your time needs to be spent in change management, not in current process analysis, not in future state design or implementation planning. At least 50% of your capacity is spent doing deep stakeholder assessment and interventions to grow your body of support. And so it's not only the methodology, and there are a number of good methodologies out there. ProSize ADCAR is just one of them, but it's the amount of attention paid to the other track that's the key differentiator between project success. Simply having a great idea, simply having good analysis or process diagnosis is not enough. Paying enough attention to the people, the politics, the resistance, the uncertainty of change, that's the key. And so I'd argue that it's not the methodology, it's the resourcing. That's the key differentiator.
I'm happy you mentioned that too, because it's one problem we constantly see where all the focus is on the pre-deployment. So the current state, the future state, and then once they get into the deployment and configuration phase for whatever system they're rolling out to support the digitization of those processes, they completely drop the ball on the change management, the retraining, and providing a platform for a voice for the end users to provide input into continuous improvement. So I constantly am pushing a pull versus a push strategy. Get the input from the end users. They're the ones who do it on a day-to-day, often have the best input and insight in terms of how they could drastically change things.
Well, there's a name for that, Scott. It's actually called the Day 2 syndrome. What happens with lots of process project teams is they finish their implementation on time and budget. They have a celebration with the users, the owners of the new process. The process team disappears. The users thank them very much. And on day 2, they go back to doing what they did before. They drop the ERP and go back to their spreadsheets because the process team never transferred ownership. And so part of the goal of change management is not to just reduce resistance, but to transfer ownership of the new way of working to the folks who have to own and execute and improve it and support it in the future. And if you haven't transferred ownership, you end up with a day two problem, which is result in an enormous waste of time because the project team's work never creates the benefit that generated the team's start in the first place.
Couldn't agree more, and I'm always preaching it's a living organism. It's an ongoing program. It's not a project. Because like you mentioned, day 2, chances are there's another level of improvement that can be achieved that you maybe didn't know until you rolled out. And then, like you said, they're off onto something else already. But I have another question here that came in that he says, in your opinion, what is the structure is more efficient for an improvement team looking forward to digitized processes? Centralized talking, cross-functional processes, or decentralized within BU?
The answer depends on your strategy and amount of resistance. Ultimately, I think a lot of organizations need to centralize more of their processes with the following general rule. I've seen a number of very smart companies say the further a process is from the customer, the end customer, the one who gives you money, the more you can centralize it. The closer you get to your key end customers, the more you can allow for local control, because that's where they may know more about the customers. And so I don't think it's the same for every process, where you locate it. And so if you've got a process like procurement, back office activities, shared service activities, I think a lot of clever organizations are creating not just shared service centers, but shared common process service centers, because they're away from the customers, whereas you wouldn't want to customize, standardize pricing or packaging, because locations make a difference. And so I think that, in the center versus periphery question, it depends on proximity. But if part of your question is around who should be on the team, almost always good process improvement teams are cross-functional. Yep. So that multiple perspectives are on the same team, sharing their insight upstream and downstream.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think where we see the world changing is it's no longer at the point of looking at a cross-functional team. It's at the point where it's even product focused. So within a team, we'll have members from each business unit even focused on a product or a service. So as a way to take a whole new revolutionary approach to that product or service, where you'll have someone from every different business unit, not just from sales, not just from operations, not just from quality, not just from support. So everyone has a voice in terms of what are the problems, what are the requirements, what are the objectives, and it's amazing the new types of product or the new offerings that the organization can leverage by bringing all teams together to form a new team. Call it a new.
I agree with that. And the other challenge on top of that, Scott, is that increasingly these teams are virtual because they're global.
Yeah.
And, I can't tell you how many times I've seen these teams sub-optimized because the organization hasn't invested in good interactive technology. And so, the team in Australia is talking to the team in Los Angeles through two tin cans connected by a rope instead of a full video audio conferencing system that minimizes buffering and allows them to operate in a more collegial and cooperative fashion.
Yeah, absolutely. I have one more because I'm watching the clock here. Steve mentioned the digital versions of UPS trucks and other examples, aka the digital twins. How new processes are supposed to evolve to handle this new dual reality with natural and digital versions of company assets?
It's the question, how are they supposed to evolve?
Yeah, how are new processes are supposed to evolve to handle this new dual reality?
Well, I think that the smarter companies we see are doing this process by process, asset by asset, and so you don't digitize everything. It's much better to march, and I know a number of organizations, for example, that have broken down the finance organization into 8 or 10 discrete processes and are digitizing them one at a time so that they can together create a digital view of the financial processes and operations and financial flows within the organization. And so I think part of it is around staging, process by process, the way Amazon is working at process by process, shelf by shelf, not as in one big all-encompassing project, but it's a series of smaller, faster projects in an agile way, quite frankly, that allows us to learn. Because if we use the same methodology, we can get the aggregate result by a lot of smaller activities.
And on that, yeah, I think often smaller, faster, agile is key, and sometimes to learn from mistakes. It's better to do something than to do nothing and then be more reactive. I think that's a constant problem. And a question that did come up and constantly comes up is the smaller organization is saying, well, often examples are tied with giants, right? Like an Amazon, they're saying, well, their deep pockets allows them to adopt such new digital practices. But I give the argument that, well, you're smaller, so you have the ability to be more agile, right?
Right. I would say if you're smaller, you have escaped the prison of an ERP, and you have the opportunity to buy best of breed software and shape the software to your processes rather than have to conform to SAP or other vendors' predefined process designs. You have a liberty as a small organization to actually get software, especially cloud software, that defines exactly who you are. I think a lot of large organizations would love the freedom of small organizations today.
That's exactly it. And I would say Amazon, their disruption was making purchasing online versus retail. But they went through their own learning curves in terms of distribution. I remember, I don't know if you saw the video where he talks about originally packaging all the boxes themselves on the floor of the warehouse. And he said, we need to improve this. We need to buy knee pads. And then someone else in his team said, well, why would we buy knee pads? Why don't we get a table so we can package boxes on the table? And he said it blew his mind, you know? So yes, they're at the point of robots now, but he's like, there was a learning curve, and they had to continuously improve, and like you mentioned, like change things along the way. So I don't look at people feel like, oh well, if you're the giant, they have the deep pockets to do so. They're often their hands are more tied because they're stuck to old ways, as you mentioned. All right, we've reached the 12 o'clock mark, so we'll wrap it up. Steve, thanks again.
Thank you, and thank everybody. Have a wonderful day.
On behalf of SoftExpert, thank you for the presence of everyone who participated in this event. If you have any questions, please contact the presenter via email. To see other webinars, ebooks, and white papers on this subject, please visit our website at www.softexpert.com. Find out more about SoftExpert solutions for enterprise business processes improvement, automation, corporate governance, excellence, and compliance management.